Hey guys, in this video, we talk about how to migrate parameter-based IT architecture to zero-trust architecture. Mainly, there are two types of zero-trust architecture. One, of course, would be pure zero-trust architecture. It would be possible to build a zero-trust architecture from the ground up in a greenfield approach. But we also mentioned this before. It's unlikely that an enterprise can migrate to a zero trust architecture in one single technology refresh cycle. So, a more down to earth solution is a zero trust architecture workflows coexist with non zero trust architecture workflow in an enterprise for quite a long period. And we call this solution hybrid zero trust architecture and parameter based architecture. This architecture is like a transitioning architecture from parameter based architecture to zero trust. In this transitioning period, some zero trust principles are applied to some components of parameter based architecture. The enterprise needs to make sure that the common elements like ID management, device management, event logging are flexible enough to operate in a zero trust architecture and parameter based hybrid security architecture. In an ideal situation, eventually, a parameter based security architecture enterprise can completely change to zero trust architecture based on its needs and case. Okay, now let's see how to migrate parameter based security architecture to zero trust architecture step by step. There are a total of 7 steps to migrate parameter based to zero trust. So NIST has a risk management framework, and this white paper has designed a zero trust architecture deployment cycle based on this risk management framework. These 7 steps are fully consistent with this design: assess, design, deploy, then operate. Actually, all the first 3 steps are set for assessment. Identify actors on the enterprise and assets owned by the enterprise. Actually, some assets not owned by enterprise need to be identified as well. Also, in this assessment phase, we need to identify key process and evaluate risks associated with executing process. We can consider these 3 steps as preliminary knowledge or like preliminary awareness before undertaking an effort to bring zero trust architecture to an enterprise. There should be a survey of assets, subjects, data flows, and workflows. The subjects include human and non-person entity, such as service accounts that interact with resource. Assets include non-enterprise owned assets and enterprise owned assets. All these assets should be taken into consideration as long as they're in the enterprise network or they can access enterprise resources. This awareness forms the foundational state that must be reached before a zero trust architecture deployment is possible. So, after the assessment, the first step, formulating policy. After all the asset, workflow, and the resource are identified, the enterprise administrator then need to make the policy for the resource used in the candidate zero trust architecture. An administrator determines the set of criteria. If they are using a criteria based trust algorithm, or they need to determine the confidence level weights if they are using a score-based trust algorithm. Also, an administrator can adjust these criteria or values during the tuning phase. The fifth step is identifying candidate solutions. Last step is to choose zero trust algorithm based on the situation. This step actually is to choose a zero trust model. We have talked about zero trust model in deployed model video, and here this paper listed 5 questions, which are 5 factors we should take into consideration while choosing a model. Ask yourself these questions based on your enterprise one by one, and then choose a matched model. Also, the best plan is to model an existing business process as a pilot program rather than just like replacement. So in case if your new zero trust architecture goes wrong, you can still have a functioning network. The pilot can be used as a proving ground for zero trust architecture before the whole network transitioning, like all subjects to zero trust architecture deployment, and away from the legacy process infrastructure. Then, once the candidate workflow and the zero trust architecture components are chosen, the initial deployment can start. Like we just said, it's better if we implement the developed policy, trust algorithm, and model by using the selected components, but only operate in an observation and monitoring model at first. The key in this phase, this step, is to make sure there is a working network, there is a backup. When enough confidence is gained and the workflow policy set is refined, the new zero trust architecture enters the steady operational phase. Then it's a final step of migrating pyramid-based architecture to zero trust architecture. The network and assets are still monitored and traffic is logged, but responses and policy modifications are done at a low tempo. Tuning phase is done, so all the tuning should not be severe. At this stage, the enterprise administrator can begin planning the next phase of zero trust deployment, and the whole structure should be reconsidered if there is any major change to subjects or assets in the network. Like the previous rollout, a candidate workflow and solution set need to be identified again and the initial policy developed. All the 7 steps should be repeated again. So this step is the final step for one cycle, but we can consider it the first step of the next zero trust implementation. So that's the whole process of migrating parameter-based security architecture to zero trust architecture in a very high level. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.